A ruthless businessman and a humble teenager cross paths unexpectedly. Amid leftovers from a dinner and a transplant of hope, family secrets come to light. Can a dark past transform hardened hearts? Discover how love can reveal surprising truths. Richard Osterberg had always been a ruthless businessman. At 45, he had built an impressive commercial empire, but his relentless pursuit of success left little room for meaningful relationships. His mansion in the suburbs was a monument to his wealth, with its gleaming marble floors and expensive artworks adorning the walls. However, emptiness echoed through the halls, a constant reminder of the price he paid for his ambition. Sarah, a 40-year-old woman with kind eyes and hands calloused from hard work, had been Richard's housekeeper for over a decade. She was raising her son Mark alone, a 16-year-old boy with messy dark hair and thick glasses that were always slipping down his nose. Mark was a dedicated, quiet and introspective student who spent most of his free time reading or studying. On an autumn evening, the aroma of a sophisticated dinner lingered in the air of the mansion's kitchen. Richard had organised a business dinner, and as usual there were abundant leftovers. Sarah was cleaning the kitchen when Mark arrived from the library, starving after a long study session. "Mum, is there anything to eat? I'm starving," Mark asked, his eyes gleaming at the sight of plates with gourmet food leftovers. Sarah smiled affectionately. "Of course, dear. You can help yourself to the leftovers. Mr. Osterberg won't mind." Mark began serving himself eagerly, savouring every bite of a meal he rarely had the chance to experience. It was at that moment that Richard entered the kitchen, his face twisting into an expression of disgust at the scene. "What is this?" Richard's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Are you eating the leftovers from my dinner?" Mark froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. Sarah quickly intervened. "Mr. Osterberg, I'm sorry. I told Mark he could eat. I thought it wouldn't be a problem since there's always so much food left over." Richard raised a hand, silencing her. His cold eyes fixed on Mark. "Boy, aren't you ashamed? Eating leftovers like a beggar. Is that how your mother raised you?" Richard's words hit Mark like a punch to the stomach. The teenager lowered his eyes, his face burning with shame. Sarah placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder, but remained silent, fearing she would lose her job if she protested. I'm very sorry, sir," Mark murmured, his voice almost inaudible. Richard snorted with disdain. "Save those leftovers for the dogs, Sarah, and teach your son some dignity." With that, he spun on his heels and left the kitchen, leaving mother and son in a heavy and painful silence. In the following weeks, the incident lingered like a dark cloud over the house. Sarah continued her work with the usual efficiency, but there was a palpable tension in the air whenever Richard was around. Mark, for his part, avoided crossing paths with the businessman at all costs, preferring to stay in his small room at the back of the property, or spend even more time at the local library. Richard, on the other hand, barely thought about the occurrence. His life continued at its usual frenetic pace, filled with meetings, negotiations, and business dinners. However, an unusual fatigue began to settle in his body. Initially, he attributed it to stress and age, but when he started experiencing dizziness and intense abdominal pain, he finally gave in to his personal assistant's insistence to see a doctor. The diagnosis came as a shock. Richard was suffering from a rare disease that affected his kidneys. He would urgently need a transplant. The news was a devastating blow for the man who had always considered himself invincible. While Richard dealt with the new reality of his mortality, Sarah and Mark continued their routine. One night, as Sarah was preparing dinner, she noticed that Mark seemed thoughtful. "What's wrong, my love?" she asked, placing a plate of rice and beans in front of him. Mark stirred his food with his fork before responding. "Mum, do you think Mr. Osterberg will be okay? I heard you talking on the phone about him being sick." Sarah sighed, sitting down next to her son. "I don't know, dear. It seems to be something serious. He needs a kidney transplant." Mark nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "Mum, What if I could help? Sarah looked at her son, surprised. What do you mean? And what if I were a compatible donor? Mark said, his voice gaining confidence. I could take the test. Sarah was speechless for a moment, touched by her son's compassion, especially considering how Richard had treated him. Mark, are you sure? After how he spoke to you? Mark shrugged, a small smile on his lips. Remember what you always tell me, Mum. Love is patient. Love is kind. Maybe that's what Mr. Osterberg needs now. With tears in her eyes, Sarah hugged her son, proud of the young man he was becoming. In the days that followed, Mark secretly underwent compatibility tests. To everyone's surprise, he was a perfect donor for Richard. When the news reached the businessman's ears, his initial reaction was shock and disbelief. The maid's son. The boy I caught eating leftovers, Richard murmured, incredulous when his doctor gave him the news. Dr. Anderson, a middle-aged man with grey hair and kind eyes, looked sternly at Richard. Mr. Osterberg, I don't know what happened between you, but this young man is offering to save your life. I suggest you put pride aside and accept this gift with gratitude. Richard was silent for a long moment, the reality of his situation finally dawning on him. Eventually he nodded slowly. Okay, doctor. Talk to the boy and his mother. Let's do this. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. On the eve of the operation, Richard asked to speak with Mark. The teenager timidly entered Richard's luxurious room, his eyes nervously wandering around the environment. Richard cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Mark, I want to thank you for what you're doing. I know I don't deserve your help, especially after how I treated you. Mark looked at Richard, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. It's okay, Mr. Osterberg. I want to help. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Richard felt a strange familiarity when looking at the boy, something he couldn't explain. Shaking his head to dismiss the thought, he forced himself to smile. Well, thank you again. See you tomorrow at the surgery. The operation was a success. In the weeks that followed, as Richard recovered, he found himself reflecting on his life and his choices. Mark's generosity deeply touched him, awakening feelings that had long been dormant. One day, while Sarah was helping Richard with his medication, he noticed a photo falling from her bag. Curious, he picked it up, and his heart almost stopped. The photo showed a young man, remarkably similar to Mark, hugging Sarah. Sarah! Richard called, his voice trembling. Who is this man in the photo? Sarah paled at the sight of the image. He's Mark's father, sir. He died before Mark was born. Richard felt the world spinning around him. What was his name? Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. Thomas. The shock hit Richard like a lightning bolt. Thomas was the name of his younger brother who had mysteriously disappeared 17 years ago. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in his mind. The familiarity he felt when looking at Mark, the surprising compatibility for the transplant. Sarah, Richard said, his voice barely a whisper, Thomas was my brother. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't know Mr. Osterberg. Thomas never talked much about his family. We met when he was travelling and... Richard raised a hand, interrupting her. His mind was in turmoil. Mark, the boy he had ridiculed and despised, was actually his nephew, the son of his lost brother. In the days that followed, Richard struggled to process this startling revelation. He asked Sarah to tell him everything about her relationship with Thomas, drinking in every word of the story of a brother he never really knew. Finally, Richard asked to speak with Mark. When the teenager entered his room, Richard looked at him with new eyes, seeing for the first time the reflection of his brother in the boy's face. Mark, Richard began, his voice choked, there's something you need to know. Your father, he was my brother. Mark's eyes widened in shock. What? But how? Richard told Mark everything he had discovered, watching the emotions pass across the boy's face. Shock, confusion, sadness, and finally a spark of hope. "Does this mean that you're my uncle?" Mark asked hesitantly. Richard nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yes, Mark. And I am very, very sorry for how I treated you. I was a foolish and blind fool. You and your mother deserve so much more." Mark was silent for a long moment, processing everything. Finally, he looked at Richard. "What happens now?" Richard took a deep breath. "Now, if you and your mother allow, I would like to try to fix things. To be the family we should have been from the start." In the months that followed, the dynamic at the Osterberg mansion changed dramatically. Richard insisted that Sarah and Mark move into rooms in the main house. He dedicated himself to getting to know his nephew, discovering with surprise and joy that they had much in common. Richard started spending more time at home, reducing his workload to focus on his new family. He helped Mark with his studies, impressed by the boy's intelligence and dedication. Sarah, initially cautious about the sudden change, gradually began to open up, sharing stories of Thomas and allowing Richard to know the brother he never had the chance to truly understand. Richard's transformation did not go unnoticed by his employees and business associates. The cold and calculating man gave way to someone more compassionate and understanding. He began implementing more employee-friendly policies in his companies and getting involved in charity projects. One day, while walking through the mansion's garden, Mark asked Richard, "Uncle, why have you changed so much?" Richard stopped, looking at his nephew with a gentle smile. "Mark, you and your mother taught me something I had forgotten a long time ago. True wealth is not in bank accounts or expensive cars. It is in the relationships we build, in the love we share." Mark smiled, feeling closer to his uncle than he ever imagined possible. "You know, my mother always says that love is patient, love is kind." Richard nodded, wrapping an arm around Mark's shoulders. "Your mother is a wise woman, and you both have shown me the true meaning of those words." As the months turned into years, the Osterberg mansion, once cold and impersonal, became a home full of love. Richard, Sarah, and Mark formed a close family, each one healing the wounds of the past and building a brighter future together. Richard never ceased to marvel at the turnaround in his life. The boy he once despised for eating leftovers not only saved his life physically, but also rescued him from an empty and lonely existence. He learned that true strength lies not in power or money, but in the ability to love, forgive, and connect with others. The lesson that Richard learned, and that he shared with everyone he knew, was simple but profound. True wealth lies in family relationships, compassion, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. And in his new life, surrounded by the love of his newly discovered family, Richard finally felt truly rich. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.